For anyone who doesn't know, there is a pervasive narrative nowadays that the bisexual community has a history of transphobia. Indeed, rampant transphobia is a word that I've seen used. I've never really seen citations for this. I've never really seen sources. And having done bisexual activism for the last 10 years, I've never really been a part of any community that had this kind of rampant transphobia. So I want to take a look back. I want to see what I can find. I want to dig through and see if through the 70s to the 2000s, was the bi community rampantly transphobic? I think this shouldn't be hard. My hypothesis is it won't be too difficult to find if it's there. When you look back at lesbian radical feminism, it's very easy when you look back at early lesbian activism to find transphobia. Really, really easy. Exclusionist transphobic politics were part of this kind of biological gender essentialism that was part of the movement, in particular lesbian separatism. So if this was happening in bisexual communities, I don't think it will be hard to find. So first of all, I'm not really going to be talking about bisexuals as individuals. You may have met a bisexual who is transphobic, but that's not evidence of an attitude in the overall community. There are many people who, when we say the gay community or the bi community, we generally mean everyone. So a random 12-year-old who just came out as bisexual, we say you're a part of the community, even if that 12-year-old has never met another bisexual in their life, right? But what I'm going to be focusing on is the actual community work, the activism, the social groups. One thing that's made this tricky is that bisexuals have nothing to prove. This idea that now bisexuals have to sort of prove themselves. In the 70s, the idea that you had to prove that you were a trans ally was a little bit ridiculous. And at the time, the term transgender didn't even exist, right? It was, you would say, transvestite and transsexual, which a lot of people would find those terms to be offensive now, but they weren't. These were the terms that the trans community was using at the time. Transsexual, transvestite, drag queen, those things we kind of conflate now into a larger category called transgender. There's also the question of the non-binaries. Were bisexuals accepting of non-binaries? Would they have been accepting of non-binary people? Which is hard to say because the term non-binary is actually very, very new. It's only in the 2010s that non-binary was popularized as a term for a group of people who more recently before that were referred to as genderqueer for about, I don't know, sort of the late 90s to sort of the mid 2010s. But there definitely wasn't a group called non-binary or even genderqueer in the 1970s, for instance. So it's going to be interesting to try and analyze that. But also, if you identified yourself as a transsexual or a transvestite, it didn't necessarily translate to binary trans person. I think we have this idea now that if you were a transsexual in the 70s, then you were a binary. And there's a really strong, strict line between the non-binaries and the binaries. The earliest instances of the bisexual community that I could find were in the 1970s, so sort of post-Stonewall. In the 1960s, it was an era of, the free love movement, and people did gather in spaces that were very open to bisexuality, but there wasn't a distinct named bisexual community until the 70s. The San Francisco Bisexual Center opened in 1976. This was just 7 years after Stonewall, and around the same time that David Bowie and Elton John were actually coming out as bisexual. So bisexuality was starting to enter the public consciousness in pop culture, but it still wasn't very well known. David Lorea, who was one of the co-founders and co-runners of the Bisexual Center, it was actually in his house, he later looked back and he said, there were a lot of transvestites and transsexuals who came to the San Francisco Bisexual Center in the 70s because they were not going to be turned away because of the way they dressed. I found a transgender newsletter from 1980 called The Gateway, and in this I found an ad for the Bisexual Center for a workshop about gender and sexuality. We will explore the interrelationships of gender feelings and sexual preference. We will look at the male and female sides of our personality and how we feel about those aspects of ourselves that differ from the stereotype. We will do some processes to determine the MF aspects of ourselves, and we'll explore how we feel about them. We will discuss sexuality and whether we choose to play out the gender role assigned to us by society, or whether we can shift to attitudes supposedly held by the opposite gender if those feel good to us. We will deal with the issue of TVTS, transvestite and transsexual, in transition and how sexuality evolves as gender role changes. We will attempt to present a summary of the fragmented and confusing information on gender and sexuality. So I do kind of get the impression that the San Francisco Bisexual Center was open to trans people. It was open in terms of gender and gender roles and gender expression. I haven't been able to find too much specifically focusing on trans people from the 1980s, unfortunately, but they were very tumultuous times for the bisexual community. The Bi Center actually shut down so the people that worked there could focus on HIV activism. But in the 90s, we have a fabulous resource called Anything That Moves. It was a bisexual magazine, which you may have heard of in relation to the Bisexual Manifesto. Do not assume that bisexuality is binary or duogamous in nature, that we have two sides, or that we must be involved simultaneously with both genders to be fulfilled human beings. In fact, don't assume that there are only two genders. That was from the 1990 issue of Anything That Moves. And from what I've heard, the Bisexual Manifesto was around for a couple of years before that. It was kind of passed around, copied at Pride and passed around, and it kind of evolved slowly over time and then ended up in this final version that we see in the first issue of Anything That Moves. A couple of years later, in 1992, we had this quote from Naomi Tucker: "With respect to our integrity as bisexuals, it is our responsibility to include transgendered people in our language, in our communities, in our politics, and in our lives." A few of the magazine covers featured trans people on the cover with trans content inside written by trans people. From the earliest years of the bi community, significant numbers of transvestites, transsexuals, and transgender people have always been involved in it. The bi community served as a kind of refuge for people who felt excluded from the established lesbian and gay communities. Perhaps given the dropping of the terms bisexual and transgender from the mission statement of Lesbian and Gay Pride, the groups could even coordinate a separate bisexual and transgendered pride. One issue featured Kate Bornstein, who would later say, "We're taught man, man, woman, 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 man, top, bottom, butch, femme, man, woman, man, etc. We're never taught person, person. That's what the bisexual movement has been trying to teach us." In an essay for the book Bisexual Politics, Martin Damon wrote an essay about transsexual inclusion. "The bisexual community should be a place where lines are erased. Bisexuality dismisses, disproves, and defies dichotomies. It connotes a loss of rigidity and absolutes. It is an inclusive term." Meanwhile, in the UK, in 1998, the Bisexual Conference, BICON, which is still running today, put in its guidelines inclusion of trans people. BICON should accept transgender people as being on their chosen gender. This includes any single gender events. In 2001 and 2003, they held transgender workshops. You can still find this information on their websites, which have been archived online. In 2004, they had a gender and sexuality workshop and an androgyny workshop. 2006 had an intersectionality workshop with a focus on trans issues. And this was really supposed to be the era of trans exclusion. This was the rampant transphobia that we're so worried about. And honestly, I can't find it, which is really shocking. You'd think there would at least be something with like an eye roll at trans people, but the worst I have found is sort of language that we would consider inappropriate today and maybe would have been inappropriate at the time, but it doesn't seem to be ill-meaning in any way. The community leaders seem to vary from happy to have them along to incredibly enthusiastic to include them. But another reason that people tend to give for this supposed transphobia is specifically related to non-binary people, in this idea that because there's the prefix bi, that bisexuals must be obsessed with the binary and love the binary, which we've already seen. Bisexuals don't seem to be that into the binary. They seem to think of bisexuals as a non-binary sexuality, if you will. So let's see, how were people talking about and thinking about and defining bisexuality in the 70s through the 90s. Kate Millett concluded in her December 1974 talk by lauding the very wealth and humanity of bisexuality itself, for to exclude from one's love any entire group of human beings because of class, age, or race or religion or sex is surely to be poorer, deeply and systematically poorer. Are we ever going to be able to define what bisexuality is? Never completely. I am bisexual because I am drawn to particular people regardless of gender. It doesn't make me wishy-washy, confused, untrustworthy, or more sexually liberated. It makes me bisexual. Bisexual usually also implies that relations with gender minorities are possible. Bisexuals fall in love with a person, not a gender. Bisexual consciousness, because of its amorphous quality and inclusionary nature, posed a fundamental threat to the dualistic and exclusionary thought patterns which were, and still are, tenaciously held by both the gay liberation leadership and its enemies. I don't want to discount the possibility that there was some kind of transphobia or non-binary phobia happening somewhere, but I can't find it. Any references that I find to trans people tend to be relatively positive or neutral, or talk about bisexuals and trans people mutually breaking boundaries and defying the dichotomies of gender. Nowadays, I know of a lot of non-binary community leaders, people who are running programming for bisexuals. There's a lot of non-binary ones, okay? And it doesn't feel like non-binary people are excluded from bi communities. And to me, it never has. And again, there are transphobic bisexuals out there. Absolutely. And there are also transphobic lesbians and gay men and straight people. That's just what cis people do, is be transphobic sometimes. But overall, was the bisexual community a transphobic environment? Was it binary obsessive? Did it condemn androgyny? It doesn't look like it. And I've spoken to older bisexual activists as well who find it very upsetting that the work that they did, that they considered to be this radical breaking of binaries and the chains of patriarchy and heteronormativity and gender, it's now seen without any evidence. It seemed to be exclusionary and transphobic. And it makes me wonder, is this rumor that bisexuals are gender-obsessed biological essentialists, is this just another of those rumors bisexuals spread HIV, bisexuals are cheaters, bisexuals don't exist? There are a lot of rumors about bisexuality that are very pervasive, and I'm starting to think that this is just another one of them. The bi community has always been a scapegoat, but also the bi community has always been strong, and it's been a place where boundaries are broken. It's been a non-binary sexuality. And from my perspective in the bisexual community, I don't think that's going to change.